For the past Luto cycle, we had peace, something the great coalition of our stars had never before seen. There were many voices as to what made it possible, but none spoke the true reason. The Terrans. They were the real reason. In every conflict that they had entered, the fighting had died almost immediately. Not because the Terrans were great diplomats, nor were they bulwarks. No. The Terrans were nightmares given form. Conflicts died because the fighters died or fled when faced with these nightmarish beings. They waded into conflict as though they were born to it. Dark rumours even spoke of Terrans taking trophies from their fallen enemies. Even darker rumours suggested that if Terrans were to fight one another, there would befall all witnesses a great cataclysm. But for the Luto cycle, the Terrans have slept, seemingly content to be the nightmares of the Coalition, beings with whom abyssal deals are struck at a terrible cost. The Coalition dared not challenge them. These monstrous beings were protected by their great machines, and the wrath of even one Terran would be terrible. But then the Drutai came. We tried to welcome them as a unified coalition should always greet a new species to the stars. But the Drutai cared not. To them, they were the rightful rulers of all species, and we were to cede the stars to them. Such a demand was met with diplomacy. We tried to bargain with them. After all, the stars were so vast in quantity, and the worlds replete with resources that only fools would claim dominion over all, especially over worlds that could not be inhabited. But the Drutai cared not. All belonged to them, and in the Luto cycle since the Terrans had gone to sleep, we no longer had the armies, nor the vessels to oppose the Drutai. Their vessels came primed for war, ignoring our calls for diplomacy, intent only on driving us to what few worlds they seemed willing to designate for us, and even then, it appeared that the Drutai would permit none but themselves to be amongst the stars. Some in the coalition suggested that the Drutai meant only to subjugate us in doing this, that perhaps we might surrender and serve under the Drutai. Such a suggestion was entirely distasteful, but in the moment, we didn't seem to have much greater options. None dared suggest making a bargain with the Terrans. Perhaps we had forgotten about them. Perhaps we were too afraid of what they represented, but it didn't matter. The coalition issued a surrender. The Drutai refused it. They cursed our surrender and said that it spoke of it being proof that we did not deserve to live in the stars. And with that, the onslaught of the Drutai against 100 worlds began. We had no great fortresses, nor great caches of weapons, but what we had permitted us to hold portions of our worlds and keep our people safe. For a time. The Drutai continued and continued. They ravaged the lands and poisoned the skies. They pressed every advantage and seemed to gladly spend lios of life fluid for a single death among us. I myself was on one such besieged world. Perhaps the reason we didn't hear the call was that we had forgotten to listen. Perhaps the reason we didn't reach out for strength from the coalition was that we believed there to be no reason to try except to wear out the Drutai. It was not until the fantastical vessel appeared in our sky, over our hastily built and ready-to-fall fortress city, that we remembered. And for as much as the vessel seemed tiny, hanging over our city in defiance of gravity, like a watcher, come to see us fall, the almost nightmarish appearance seemed a symbol of hope. The Drutai seemed to notice this vessel only once it began its vigil over our city. We dared not count the streams of munitions or weapons launched against it. Only one species had vessels that were that nightmarish. Only one species were that bold. Only one species had vessels capable of withstanding that level of onslaught. To say our life fluid's warmth was stolen away by the mere realization of the vessel's presence was an understatement. The nightmarish myths had awoken. None of the young ones knew of them except this myth, a dark tale mentioned in dim light and coated with life fluids. But the old ones of us knew the craft of their vessels. It appeared the Drutai didn't know what to make of them. But the Drutai cared not, and though I did not know it, similar vessels hung over the fortress cities of the 100 besieged worlds of the Coalition. And in every case, the Drutai launched as many weapons as they dared against the vessels, which hung, unmarked in the skies, refusing to be brought down or even acknowledge the attacks. The Tritai even began waking up some of their spacefaring vessels to move against these strange, new-to-them vessels that defied them. But the Terran vessel which hung in the sky, waiting for something. I knew not what they sought, or if they were simply present to bear witness to the Coalition's destruction. After a time, the Tritai returned their aims back to destroying us. We, at least, were good sport in their minds. Not nightmarish vessels which did not fight back, and seemed to lack even an interest in showing the first specks of damage. As the Tritai assault was renewed and our walls on the verge of collapsing, I looked up at the Terran vessel and mumbled a wish that the Terrans would save us, regardless of their price. The Terrans at least were unlikely to destroy us in the way that the Tritai had promised to. The wish seemed to have no longer left my speech than two vessels detached themselves from the craft that still hung in the sky and descended. One moved to land directly next to our wall, inside our fortress. The other landed just outside of it. I watched with more intent at the one which landed within. It seemed dangerous to even look at, but it was the way of Terrans. That much we knew. When the doors of the vessel opened and the figures from within moved out, we gasped. These beings did not appear to be the fiendish dangers that our more modern fantasies have made the Terrans to be, but there was no denying the danger which radiated off each Terran. They moved with purpose, and while they acknowledged our presence, they seemed to ignore us otherwise, as though we were interesting but unimportant. Standing in the presence of one along the wall, I felt buoyed with a bit of hope, but did not trust it. I wanted to take back my wish already. To stand this close to a Terran was not something I would have wished, and it had been so long that I'd truly forgotten how much what was said about Terrans was real. I saw a bit of writing that marked the back of each Terran who stood upon the wall with us, and in the presence of the Terrans, the wall seemed to have become more fortified and stronger than any of us could have dreamed up. Perhaps it was simply the presence of the Terrans, but it didn't seem to matter. Carefully, I tried to read the writing, hesitant that I might offend these Terrans. Resist and bite. It seemed a strange few words, but it must be powerful to these Terrans, or else they would not adorn themselves thusly. I realized then that the sounds of the Tritai assault had faded, and I looked beyond the walls. There I could see a group of Terrans who appeared to be even more fearsome. They were clearly clad in fearsome armour, and while each bore a weapon, those weapons were simply attached to their sides. The Terrans in the space beyond the wall simply formed a broad line and began to walk towards the Tritai, a few of whom began to move up and forward towards the Terrans. I knew it was the like of beings that none of the Tritai had ever seen before today, and I doubted any of them would realise that as a mistake. For reasons I could not fathom, the Tritai threw themselves at the Terrans outside the wall. There were only a few of them, and the Tritai were in numbers beyond counting. In those first few moments that I bore witness to, I will admit to having seen greater horrors than even the more terrifying nightmare. Tritai seemed to dissolve when they met a Terran, their bodies falling to the ground, and their life fluids spilling out. After those first few moments, the Tritai seemed to notice and paused. And it was in that moment that I heard the Terrans from beyond the wall call out as one, "Rip and tear." Terran Expeditionary Reaction Force. Awakening Protocol number 8-23-1. Coalition Species Aid Request. Logged. Infestation of Class 5 Devourer species. Use of force. Authorized. With extreme prejudice.